Imagine boarding a flight, expecting a routine trip, when the person sitting across from you thinks they can humiliate you because of the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened to James Carter, an elderly black man who appeared ordinary, quiet, harmless. But James carried a secret so powerful that it would turn this flight into a lesson Charles, a racist passenger, would never forget. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, just another trip in the sky, until Charles opened his mouth. He didn't know who he was about to insult, but the words that left his lips were cruel, sharp, and full of arrogance. James, sitting quietly, didn't flinch at first. But behind his calm eyes was a storm, a life full of battles, triumphs, and a secret no one on that plane could have imagined. Charles laughed, thinking he was untouchable. But James's silence was not weakness. Every sneer, every mocking glance, it all built a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing something extraordinary was about to happen, but none of them could guess the twist waiting at 30,000 feet. James had a secret that could change the very ground Charles stood on, and the moment of reckoning was closer than anyone realized. Who was James really? And why would a single flight turn into the ultimate lesson in pride, power, and karma? Stay with me, because by the time this plane lands, nothing, and I mean nothing, will ever be the same. James Carter had always moved through life with quiet dignity. At 72, his silver hair and deep-set eyes told a story of battles fought and wisdom earned. He lived in a modest but well-kept home, tucked away in a tree-lined neighborhood where neighbors nodded politely, some with respect, others with barely concealed judgment. James had retired from decades of running businesses, but his mind was sharp and his spirit unyielding. Most people saw an elderly man, slow-moving and soft-spoken. Few knew he had built an empire from nothing, an airline that carried thousands across the skies, yet whose ownership remained a secret to most. Every morning, James followed the same routine. He drank his coffee on the small balcony overlooking the city, reading the headlines and letting the sun warm his face. He greeted familiar shopkeepers, smiled at children playing outside, and occasionally joked with old friends who still dropped by for conversation. Life was calm, measured, predictable. But even in this tranquility, there were reminders of a world that often refused to see him for who he truly was. Subtle glances in stores, whispers behind hands, casual dismissals. Society had its way of treating an old black man with a mix of politeness and invisible boundaries, lines he was expected never to cross. James never let it bother him too much. He had learned to navigate a world that underestimated him. Yet the quiet indignities were always there, like shadows trailing his every step. That morning he boarded his flight as he had countless times before. He wore a crisp gray suit, his red tie a bold but tasteful touch. As he passed through the cabin, he exchanged polite nods with the flight attendants. Everything seemed ordinary, but in the back of his mind, James sensed that change was coming, an interruption to the calm, a clash he hadn't yet anticipated. Across the aisle, Charles sat alone, a man whose confidence carried the sharp edge of entitlement, the kind that masked ignorance with arrogance. James didn't know it yet, but Charles's path would collide with his own in a way that neither of them could have imagined. James settled into his seat, gazing out at the clouds as the engines roared to life. The hum of the cabin, the murmurs of fellow passengers, the scent of coffee and recycled air, it all felt normal. But for James, the world was about to remind him that respect is not always freely given. Sometimes it must be demanded, and sometimes it arrives in a way that leaves the instigator utterly unprepared. The flight had barely leveled off when Charles first made his presence known. At first it was subtle, a muttered complaint about the seatbelt, a sigh that seemed louder than necessary, an eye roll when James politely asked the flight attendant for a glass of water. James ignored it, accustomed to a world where small slights were part of daily life. But the air in the cabin seemed to thicken, each word Charles muttered carrying a weight of arrogance and underlying disdain. By the time the drinks cart arrived, Charles could no longer contain himself. "Honestly," he said, loud enough for half the row to hear, "I don't understand why the airline seats these people like this. Don't you have a special section for..." His eyes flicked over James, dripping with condescension. People like him? A hush fell over the passengers. James's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the insult. He felt the familiar sting of prejudice, the way it seeks to diminish, humiliate, and rewrite your place in the world. But James had learned long ago that rage alone is rarely the answer. He looked at Charles, his expression calm, almost amused. Yet behind the calm was a storm, memories of decades fighting against injustice, fighting to be seen, fighting to matter. The tension escalated when Charles decided to make it personal. "Do you even belong here?" he sneered. "Shouldn't someone like you, I don't know, be sitting somewhere else?" His words were cruel, rehearsed even, as if he had been waiting for a moment to assert dominance over someone he considered inferior. The cabin grew quieter. Even the flight attendants felt the shift in energy, unsure how to intervene. James took a deep breath. He could feel the anger simmering in the rows around them. Other passengers shifting uneasily, some avoiding eye contact, others watching with silent curiosity. Charles, in his arrogance, thought the silence was his ally, but James's mind was calculating. Memories of early mornings, long nights, and the battles he had endured flashing like lightning. He knew the weight of his next move. Charles continued, louder now, throwing his sense of superiority like a shield. "I don't know why they let people like you run airlines. People like you, old, washed up, irrelevant, shouldn't be in charge of anything." A few passengers muttered under their breath. Some exchanged looks of discomfort, others subtly intrigued. James's pulse was steady, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. The words could have been a dagger to someone else, but James had learned to convert insult into strategy. Then, without warning, Charles tried to escalate physically, leaning into James's space, his tone dripping with menace. "I'm serious. You don't belong here," he hissed. James's hand barely twitched, resting on the armrest. But in that moment, every microsecond stretched into eternity. James's thoughts raced. Decades of being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. And yet, here he sat, with all the power Charles could never imagine. The secret he had carried quietly throughout his life, a secret that could shatter Charles's sense of control, was close to the surface. A lifetime of careful planning, of building an empire that none of these passengers knew existed, had led to this exact moment. Passengers began to notice subtle changes. Flight attendants glanced nervously. The murmurs grew. Charles, oblivious, was about to learn a lesson he had never signed up for. And just as James was about to act, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Drinks rattled, a tray clattered to the floor, and the cabin fell momentarily into chaos. Charles gripped his armrest, swearing under his breath, while James's calm eyes never wavered. When the turbulence passed, James leaned slightly forward, his voice low but carrying a quiet authority. "Sir," he said, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who's in charge here." Charles froze. There was no hint, no warning in James's tone, but the words carried weight, unshakable and poised. Every passenger felt the shift, though they didn't yet understand why. The tension became almost unbearable, like the moment before a storm breaks. And then, in a single calculated move, James revealed what Charles had no idea, what the world had underestimated for far too long. Charles's eyes widened, disbelief and shock flashing across his face. The smugness, the arrogance, the sense of entitlement, all shattered in an instant. But before anyone could react, the plane hit another jolt of turbulence, and James leaned back, letting the moment stretch. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. Would Charles survive this revelation with his pride intact? Or was the reckoning just beginning? The cabin was silent, but every eye was locked on James now. The old man they had seen as quiet, unassuming, and fragile was no longer just a passenger. He was a force they had underestimated, and Charles was about to learn that some lessons are delivered at 30,000 feet. The cabin had gone silent. The hum of the engines was the only sound, yet it felt deafening. Every passenger was acutely aware of the tension between James and Charles, but no one could have anticipated what was coming. Charles, still flush with arrogance, leaned back in his seat, smirking as if he had already won. He thought he had humiliated James, forced him into submission with insults and ridicule, and silenced the presence of a black man who dared to occupy space he deemed unworthy. But James had never been one to crumble under the weight of prejudice. James slowly rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried, a calmness that only made Charles more agitated. The passengers shifted in their seats, some clutching their armrests, others holding their breath. Charles opened his mouth to deliver another cutting remark, but this time, the words caught in his throat. James's eyes met his. A quiet storm of years lived, battles fought, victories won, and injustices endured. There was no malice, no hatred in those eyes. Just undeniable authority. "Charles," James said, his voice low but carrying across the cabin, "I think you need to understand something before you continue." Charles laughed nervously, attempting to mask the creeping unease. "Oh, and what's that?" he sneered. "That you can't take a little joke?" James smiled faintly, a predator's calm before the strike. "Not a joke," he said. "The truth." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small tablet, projecting a live feed across the cabin monitors. The passengers gasped as their screens illuminated with corporate logos, airline routes, and news clippings. "Charles," James continued, his voice steady, "I own this airline. Every plane, every route, every flight attendant, every terminal. Every person on this plane is under my leadership, including you." Charles froze, the smirk vanishing from his face, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as he stammered, That's impossible! You're just an old man." James's gaze never wavered. "Old? Perhaps. Just never. I built this empire from nothing, and people like you have spent your lives trying to intimidate those you deem weaker. Today the tables have turned. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Passengers stared in awe, shock, and silent vindication. Some whispered apologies. Others shook their heads, while a few tried to discreetly record the moment. Charles's face flushed crimson, a mix of embarrassment, anger, and helplessness washing over him. James didn't need to raise his voice. The revelation alone had dismantled Charles's arrogance. Every insult, every sneer, every moment he had thought himself superior, now hung as an indictment in front of the very people he sought to impress or intimidate. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Charles tried to argue, to assert dominance as he always had. This doesn't mean silence, James interrupted, his tone final. You will not speak over me, over anyone, or over the dignity you tried to strip from me today. You thought you could belittle me. You thought that your race and ego gave you immunity, but it doesn't, not here, not now. Not ever. A tense pause filled the cabin. Charles's eyes darted to the flight attendants, searching for some support, some validation, but even they avoided meeting his gaze. James had stripped him of the illusion of control, and the humiliation was tangible. Then James leaned closer to Charles, speaking in a measured, icy whisper that only he could hear. I could have had you removed from this flight, exposed to the world for what you are. But I believe in lessons, not revenge. Today, you've learned that arrogance and hatred have limits, and that those limits are enforced by truth, resilience, and the people you underestimate. Charles's shoulders slumped slightly. He looked around, realizing for the first time that the world did not bend to his bigotry. The passengers, once spectators, were now silent witnesses to a reckoning decades in the making. Every whispered insult, every patronizing glance, every instance of assumed superiority had collided in this singular moment. And Charles had nowhere to hide. James straightened, his calm and controlled presence filling the cabin. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks power comes from intimidation, cruelty, or ignorance. Respect is earned, dignity is inherent, and arrogance has consequences. The tension was almost unbearable. Every passenger could feel it, the electric charge of witnessing not just humiliation, but justice, measured and precise. Charles' lips quivered as he tried to respond, to regain a shred of authority, but the words faltered, meaningless against the weight of what James had just revealed. James finally returned to his seat, settling back as though nothing had happened. But the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The arrogant man who sought to demean another now sat diminished, his mask of superiority shattered. The cabin, once tense with unease, now buzzed with a mix of relief, astonishment, and quiet satisfaction. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, James's eyes scanned the plane, not with malice, but with the weight of lived experience. There was still work to be done. There were still battles outside these walls, outside this flight, and outside the invisible chains that society placed on people like him. The victory was powerful, yes, but fleeting in a world that rarely offers permanent justice. As the plane hummed steadily through the sky, James allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Charles slumped, defeated, realizing that no amount of privilege could shield him from truth and integrity. And for the passengers, the lesson was unmistakable. Appearances deceive. Arrogance blinds, and sometimes, the quietest people wield the greatest power. And then, just as James leaned back, the plane hit a slight turbulence, enough to jolt the cabin slightly, and a soft voice whispered from behind, "Sir, what happens next?" James didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the endless sky, a world full of possibilities and challenges ahead. And for a brief, electrifying moment, the audience could sense that while one battle had ended, the journey, the fight for respect, dignity, and equality was far from over. The climax ended not with a scream or a fight, but with a poised, electrifying calm. The old black man had won, but the story was far from finished. The tension in the cabin gradually eased, but the echoes of what had just transpired lingered in the minds of everyone on board. Passengers sat in quiet awe, still processing the revelation that the seemingly ordinary elderly man they had dismissed was, in fact, the powerful owner of the airline. Charles slouched in his seat, red-faced and humiliated, his arrogance thoroughly dismantled. But James Carter didn't gloat. He understood that true power is exercised with restraint and dignity, not through vengeance. For James, the flight had become more than a confrontation. It had become a statement, a moment that crystallized decades of struggle, resilience, and silent triumph. He had endured a lifetime of prejudice, subtle and overt, from the world that sought to underestimate him because of his age, his race, and the assumptions people made about both. But every insult, every condescending glance, and every whispered judgment had shaped him into someone who could respond with precision and unassailable authority when the moment finally arrived. As the plane cruised steadily toward its destination, James reflected on the ripple effects of what had happened. Charles, once so confident in his perceived superiority, would carry the memory of this moment for the rest of his life. The arrogance that had fueled his casual cruelty had been stripped away in front of witnesses, leaving him no room to hide behind entitlement. But more than humiliation, James hoped this moment planted a seed of reflection in Charles, a chance, however small, for personal growth. The passengers, meanwhile, were forever changed. What they had witnessed went beyond an individual confrontation. It was a lesson in courage, dignity, and the quiet, unstoppable force of a person underestimated by society. The murmurs of astonishment gave way to whispers of admiration. Some passengers, who had remained silent observers, felt inspired to confront their own biases, recognizing how easily they had accepted appearances without understanding the truth beneath. In that confined space, James had taught a profound lesson. Respect cannot be demanded through fear or intimidation. It is rooted in character, integrity, and the lived experiences of those we too often ignore. James's intervention also sparked reflection among the airline staff. Flight attendants and crew who had been uneasy during the confrontation were now silently empowered. They had witnessed an old man, quietly and confidently, take command of a situation that could have spiraled into chaos. His example demonstrated that strength is not measured in volume or aggression, but in courage, composure, and clarity of purpose. For many, it was a lesson in leadership, humility, and moral authority, a reminder that power used wisely can correct injustices without creating new harm. Back on the ground, the repercussions of the flight extended far beyond the passengers and crew. James, while private about his wealth and influence, understood that his example could resonate widely. The story of an old black man standing up to blatant racism, revealing his hidden authority, and teaching a lesson without cruelty or spectacle. was the kind of narrative that could inspire communities, challenge societal prejudices, and shift perspectives. He had shown that courage and integrity are potent forces that can outshine hate and entitlement. For Charles, the consequences were immediate and lasting. Once the news of the confrontation spread, inevitably through social media, passengers' accounts, and news outlets, his professional and social circles were forced to reckon with his behavior. The arrogance he had relied upon, the casual cruelty he had used as armor, now stood exposed. While some may have dismissed the incident as a mere embarrassment, those who understood its implications recognized a deeper lesson. Prejudice and arrogance do not protect anyone from accountability, and attempts to belittle others often rebound with consequences more severe than anticipated. In the days following the flight, James returned to his life as quietly and gracefully as ever. He maintained his routine, sipping coffee on the balcony, reading the morning headlines, and greeting neighbors with his characteristic warmth. Yet beneath the calm exterior, there was a profound sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through retaliation or spectacle, but through the quiet, undeniable force of truth. The moment aboard the plane became part of his personal legacy, a testament to resilience, intelligence, and moral courage. More importantly, the experience reinforced a broader truth. Society's structures may not always protect the marginalized, but the dignity, wisdom, and courage of individuals can still create change. Prejudice weakens communities by breeding fear, resentment, and division. Racism corrodes trust, frays relationships, and isolates people. But acts of courage, integrity, and moral clarity, like James's intervention, remind us that unity, respect, and justice are possible, even in the face of systemic injustice. For viewers, the takeaway is unmistakable. James's story is not just about one flight, one passenger, or one confrontation. It is about every moment in life where bias, hatred, or arrogance seeks to diminish another person. It is about the power of resilience, the quiet strength of those underestimated, and the moral imperative to stand firm in the face of injustice. It reminds us that courage can defeat hate, that dignity can disarm cruelty, and that unity can heal the wounds created by prejudice. By the time the passengers disembarked, the flight had become more than a journey from one city to another. It had become a microcosm of society, a vivid demonstration of how injustice can be challenged with intelligence and composure, and how courage can inspire transformation in ways that brute force or anger never could. The lessons of the flight lingered long after the plane touched the runway. For James, the impact was subtle, yet profound. He had turned a moment of potential humiliation into a demonstration of power, grace, and moral clarity. In the end, the story of James and Charles serves as a timeless reminder. Prejudice and arrogance are temporary, but integrity, courage, and dignity endure. The old black man had shown the world that no insult, no act of hatred, no attempt to belittle could erase his worth or his authority. And for those who witnessed it, passengers, crew, and eventually, the wider public, the lesson was clear. True power is not in dominance, but in standing tall, unwavering, and unyielding in the face of injustice. The ripple effects of that flight would continue long after its wheels left the tarmac. Conversations were sparked, perspectives shifted, and a quiet but undeniable change began to take root. James's story, shared and retold, became more than a personal victory. It became a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope, and a call to action for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or oppressed. And so, the flight that began with cruelty and arrogance ended with clarity, justice, and profound moral resonance. For James Carter, the old black man who had faced prejudice with dignity and courage, the message was simple yet powerful. Hate can be challenged, prejudice can be overcome, and courage can turn even the most ordinary moment into a legacy of inspiration.